Today, we're going to talk about the history of the human services, and I have to tell you, it is not a pretty story. Now, all through civilization for thousands of years, there have been people in need, and these people and their needs have been treated differently at different times. So first, we're going to talk about what factors have influenced how people in need are treated. Why has it been different? And we're going to look at cases through different historical lenses at different points in history. And is a key concept that is, to me, most important in the history of human services, which is that human services are determined by the definition of the problem. Whose fault is it? What is causing this problem? And what resources, i.e. money, is society willing to spend on these people, or society think they're able to spend on them? Who is the fault? What caused the problem? And how much are we prepared to spend on these people? So what do we mean when we say definition of the problem? Well, let's think about teenagers in trouble with the law. And what are some of the things people say are the reasons that teenagers get in trouble with the law? Well, they might say, oh, well, it's poor parenting, or it's bad schools, or there aren't strong communities, or there aren't enough community services, or it's all single parenting, or the neighborhoods are bad, or there's just a lack of morals, or it's drugs, or it's racism, and there are many more things people might say. So what you think causes the problem is going to determine what you think will fix the problem. So let's go back to our teenagers in trouble with the law. If you think the problem is poor parenting, maybe the best answer is to take the child away from the parent. If you think the problem is poor schools, maybe you try to improve schools or send those children to different schools. If you think there's a lack of strong communities, you might try community organizing. If you say, well, there's a lack of community services, you might fund more community services. If you say it's single-parent households, there aren't fathers in children's lives, maybe you cut benefits to single parents receiving welfare. If you say it's bad neighborhoods, you might do what we did in the 60s called urban renewal and tear down entire neighborhoods. If you think these teenagers have a lack of morals, maybe you fund more church programs. If you think the problem is drugs, maybe you have the war on drugs and arrest anyone caught with drugs. If you think the problem is racism, maybe you begin to protest racist institutions. I'm not saying that there's one answer or several. What I'm saying is depending how a person thinks is the cause of the problem will determine how they think it should be solved. Now, throughout history, and we're talking centuries now, society has almost always recognized that certain groups of people have to be helped. People who are mentally disabled, who are physically sick, orphans and foundlings, the unemployed, widows before women had a right to work. But that help for the mentally disabled, the physically sick, orphans, unemployed, and widows, the help for these people has looked very different at different times in history. Way back in the medieval and the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church in all of Europe was the provider of human services. That's where you got any help. And mental illness was understood to be caused by demons, satanic forces that had entered into a person's brain. So, if you want to get rid of demons, you got to get the demon out of the person. And you did that by making it really uncomfortable for the demon. So the person with mental illness might be chained to the wall, they might be starved, beaten, and what's called trepanning, which literally cut a hole in a person's skull to let the demon out. Feudal lords of estates were supposed to care for the needy on their estates. And of course, the church is responsible for caring for the poor. And in addition, all the residents of that local parish were supposed to pay a tax called a tithe that would help take care of the poor and the needy in their neighborhood. But how might these services be affected by how willing anyone wanted to pay for them? If the feudal lord didn't want to spend the money, if the church didn't want to spend the money, if the people who were supposed to pay a tax didn't want to spend that tax, what would happen to the services that were supposed to be provided? People were often just sent down the road in hopes somebody else would take care of them. Now let's move up a little bit into the 1500s and the 1600s. The power of the church and the feudal lords is going down. That's declined. They're not the big powerhouses now. The government, and that means the king of the country, begins to manage services. And the king is supposed to be responsible to care for people with mental limitations. But the way they could do that is take all the revenue from that person's lands so they could pay for the care. So there could be a little problem there. A king might decide somebody is mentally incompetent, so he had the excuse to take all the lands. Or a person might truly be incompetent, but the king might not want to spend money on the person. So they began to develop institutions, and this is the first time such a thing has ever existed. And these might include orphanages, hospitals, which interestingly included both medical care and places for travelers to rest. So just a quick sideline here. Why do you think the word hospital and hospitality are so similar? Because way back 500-600 years ago, they literally did the same thing. And they began to build homes for the elderly and for the poor, and what we would know later as insane asylums. And these could be quite large institutions over time. And then times continued to change. We began the beginnings of industry and the Industrial Revolution. And as that happened, increasingly people moved out of the country and crowded into the cities for better jobs, for opportunity, for food, for a chance for more freedom. And in England, the king took over the church. That's Henry VIII and the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation, and enacted what's called the Poor Laws of 1601. And this is actually a really important moment because it's the first time in history that government wrote laws about how the needy were to be cared for. Supposedly, it was no longer going to be just up to who felt charitable or how people felt about the person in need, but supposedly there was actual laws that said who were the needy and how should they be cared for. So what did these laws look like? Well, people were classified by their ability to work. So, for instance, children would be apprenticed, sent to live with a tradesman and learn the trade, like a baker or a miller or a carpenter. If the person was able-bodied, the adult was not obviously disabled, then they were just forced to work or they'd be punished. If they were disabled, they were supposed to be cared for in home or in these new institutions. And the law also laid out who was responsible for which people in need. And of course, that means who was supposed to pay for their need. The families were expected to provide for their own members, assuming the family had any money or even existed. And if it couldn't, then it was the government's responsibility. In addition, the law said that everyone had to pay taxes to pay for this care. Compulsory taxes, people had to pay a tax. And this tax was going to help pay for the needy. And I think we all know how people feel always about having to pay taxes, no matter what that's going to.